Yali Madat, everybody. This is Akbar Punawala from the Aga Khan Economic Planning Board for the United States. On behalf of the EPB and the National Council for the USA, I would like to welcome all the people who have joined this call from the various time zones. The webinar being the State of the Economy with Ali Velshi. I'd like to introduce our guest, Ali Velshi, who really needs no introduction, but just by way of a background, many of us will know Ali and his sharp analysis from his weekend morning show of Velshi on MSNBC. Ali has covered a wide range of domestic, global, and economic issues throughout his career, including climate change, the spread and defeat of ISIS, the refugee crisis, tensions between Russia and the West, and the global financial crisis. Previously, he has served as CNN's chief business correspondent, anchor of CNN International's World Business Today, and host of CNN's weekly business roundtable, Your Money. Ali also co-hosted CNN's morning show, American Morning. An award-winning journalist, Ali was honored with the National Headliner Award for Business and Consumer Reporting. Ali is also an author, having authored 2 books, Give Me My Money Back in 2008, and co-authored another one, How to Speak Money in 2010. Born in Kenya and raised in Canada, Ali graduated from Queen's University in Canada, which bestowed an honorary doctorate of laws upon him in 2016. With that, Ali, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of all our participants today. Thank you very much for taking your Sunday afternoon and talking to the Jamaats globally with regards to the state of the economy. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chairman, and it's good to be with you. I mean, I think the irony that it's useful to let people know is that in normal times, you and I work in the same place in the middle of Manhattan. I mean, times are not normal these days. I'm actually coming to you from my home in outside of Philadelphia, but I'm normally in New York. But even then, I'm doing my shows from my home. So so many things have changed, but it's good to see you.
Excellent, good to see you, Ali. And just to get started, right? I mean, what is it like to speak to world leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, etc. So you're talking to Bill Gates one day, you're talking to a prime minister, a president one day, and you're getting all this download on the economy. You're getting a bird's eye view almost. And how does it feel? I mean, to be in that privileged position. And today we want to pick your brains a little bit. Mm-hmm. To go into the details as to what are you hearing? What are you picking up in terms of the situation in the economy given the COVID situation? So there are a number of things that obviously we read in the papers, we listen in the news, hear about from various people and through various webinars of this kind. Just wanted to get your sense and allow me to play a couple of snippets for you or show a couple of charts which will demonstrate the situation we are in. And then I'd like to invite you to provide a commentary and your take on how things look in the economy really. So the first chart here is one about the US unemployment, which has gone from 4% to 15%, with 33 million American workers unemployed in the last 7 weeks. At the same time, in Canada, the jobless rate has soared to 13%, with 3 million jobs lost in 2 months. According to the FT, UK is on the brink of the worst recession in 300 years, according to the Bank of England. Given that the sudden and significant drop in the GDP in the US, which was 4.8% in Q1 and is expected to be minus 4.8% in Q1 and negative 10% likely on an annualized basis in Q2. How do you see it, especially given the uncertainty around the vaccine and the situation globally, travel restrictions and restrictions on businesses, people's movement, etc.? How would you characterize the economic landscape, both in the US and globally?
They're not dissimilar. In that, most developed countries are experiencing this in similar ways. Different places are doing it differently, and that's worth talking about, how different types of governments and different decisions that they made at the onset of this virus will create different results. But bottom line is, this is a global and deep recession. Now, it's a bit wonky, but people who work in finance and economics often talk about the shape of a recession, right? It can be a V, which means it goes down quickly and goes up quickly. There's a W where it goes down, goes up, goes down again, and goes up. And there are various shapes, right? What does it look like? We might have to start thinking about this one differently, because it's phases. And part of that is, unlike the last recession or any recession you can remember, sometimes they're caused by oil shocks, sometimes they're caused by currency matters, sometimes they're caused by, the last one was a financial crisis. This is none of those things. This is the only recession we've ever seen that is caused by a virus and a pandemic. And the net result is that it's not really an economic situation, it's a public health issue. So the shape of this recession, or at least let's call it the shape of the recovery from the recession, because we will recover. Let's start by saying that we will recover. The shape of it will be determined by one of two things. One is whether there will be adequate therapeutics, medication, treatment. And remember that in some viruses, there's never a vaccine. In AIDS, we never got a vaccine, we got therapeutics. And it took 10 to 12 years to get the right combination of therapeutics to the extent that it has efficacy across the board. In other words, generally speaking, anybody with AIDS can get treatment and can live a life. So either you get a treatment or you get a vaccine, or you get both. We are you will see reports that are very confusing that suggest that within a few months we will have a vaccine. But my conversation with Bill Gates, who is really one of the world's foremost experts in vaccination and infectious diseases, says could be 9 months, could be 2 years, could be 3 years. I mean, if you're talking about a vaccine that you give to everybody or most people, the efficacy rate has got to be very, very high. And the ability to not have it cause other diseases and other illnesses in people has to be very, very high. So we know that there is the now, which is the emergency, and there is the recovery, which will come. But what we don't know is what happens in between the emergency and the recovery. And why I say that is because some of the Americans got a check for $1,200. Canadians are getting an ongoing check. Americans get an increase in unemployment payments for a few months. American businesses get grants if they keep people on payroll through the end of June. American airline companies got grants if they keep people on payroll through end of September. There's no chance this is over by the end of June. And there's very little chance that it's over by the end of September. So what happens when the emergency aid that our governments have provided stop, and the vaccine's not there and the therapeutic is not there? And that's not going to be the new normal, right? The new normal will arrive at, and maybe that means that we won't go to casinos and we won't go to sporting events the same way, and we won't go to movie theaters, or we'll figure out some way about how we live our lives in the new normal. But the in-between is what the issue is, because most people don't have enough money to figure out 2 years with no income or 2 years with reduced income. So when you talked about these unemployment numbers, they're going to get worse, right? Next month's unemployment number is going to be worse. We may not lose another 20 plus million jobs in a month, thank God, I hope we don't. But a lot of companies have been holding on. They took these Paycheck Protection Program checks to keep their employees on salary. But then what happens when they can't reopen their restaurant? Or what happens when a restaurant, which really kind of depends on, I spoke to a restaurateur this morning, Danny Myers from the Union Square Hospitality Group. He has Shake Shack and all those companies. He says most restaurants can't survive without 80% occupancy. So if you think restaurants won't have 80% occupancy, bars won't, movie theaters won't, hotels won't, cruise ships won't, airlines won't. Airlines have already said they'll cap the number of people on a plane. What does the new normal look like, and what do you do until then? So for all of the leaders and the senators and prime ministers that I speak to, anybody who's not a public health specialist or a health expert does not have visibility into what the new normal will look like. And I just want to add one other thing to that, Chairman. There are two parts of the new normal. There's the governors and countries saying you can leave your home and it's safe to do so. And then there's what people will really do, right? Will we suddenly go back to the same environment? Will our places of work they'll have to reconfigure desks. They'll probably want some people to stay home. They'll probably say, come in every 2 weeks or something to check in or to have some face-to-face meetings. But generally speaking, we don't want people. And by the way, there are a lot of people. Some people probably don't like all this being shut in with their family, but some people really do. And it may be really beneficial. Remember, Americans commute more than anybody else in the world commutes. So if you spend an hour or an hour and a half each way back and forth from work, you may like this new normal, and that may work into your working world. So we have no sense of what our lives will look like a year from now or 2 years from now. And that's what the big struggle is. So until we have that, the important thing for individuals is to try and do the right thing with their money, with their jobs, with their businesses, and with their planning. And that is what everybody has to do right now, because not knowing what the virus is going to do, not knowing what your government is going to do, you can only control that which you can do. And that's probably my key message that I get from people. Control what is in your realm of control.
That's excellent, Ali. And so clearly, from what we hear from you, this is not a short-term blip. It's not a 1 or 2 month incident. People went away for a holiday and came back type of thing. The lockdown ended. But many of these states in the US are gradually reopening, right? What do you see the consequences of that? And how should we be positioned as, and we want to unpack this, right? So we're going to get into detail and the implications of this to various Jamaati segments. So for instance, how should the business people in the Jamaat react? How should the professionals, the tech entrepreneurs position themselves? How should the students who are either graduating this year or going into college or starting college this year, how should the various constituencies and how should the hourly wage worker respond? How can we protect ourselves? So one of the things that we heard in one of our previous webinars is that the first thing is we need to defend ourselves to survive this crisis, right? Before we look to thrive. So can you talk about those two, especially in relation to the various segments of the Jamaat, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the first thing you have to do is health and protection, right? In terms of your family, even put aside prosperity for a second, be careful. Different segments in society feel differently about this, right? We are a nation of invincibles. We are a community of immigrants who have overcome a lot of things in life. And the one thing that a virus like this teaches you is that it doesn't actually matter how smart you are or how strong you've been in life. The virus doesn't have prejudices. It has certain prejudices against people who have to go out to work and people who live in tight quarters, but be careful. And we're all vulnerable to this until we're not. The second thing, before anything else, is this will only work if we look after our community. We look after those around us. When I say community, I mean those in your lives, right? Your neighbors, your parents. It's Mother's Day today. If you know somebody who doesn't have children, them, the people who conduct business for you in your life who are out of an income, we all have to look after each other at the moment. That's the first thing that has to happen. We will absolutely get through this, but what this thing has laid bare is the inequity in society. So if you are a wage earner who does not earn a formal income, typically has not been able to apply for uninsurance, maybe undocumented, maybe you're a service provider to people, we all have them in our lives. I know a lot of undocumented people in my life. Let's make sure we look after the people who have fallen through the cracks. We're trying to fix the system with each round of government assistance so that now, freelancers and gig workers and contract workers qualify for some of the government assistance, but it's not across the board. A lot of people who don't have health care. So I think that's number one, after you protect yourself. Whether you are an individual or a business owner or an entrepreneur or wherever you are in the scheme of things, capital preservation is the number one thing to remember. Anybody who's read a book about personal finance, yesterday morning I did a show and I had Susie Orman on my show. And as you mentioned, I've written a couple of books on it. Every single personal finance book, and there are thousands of them, tell you to start with capital preservation. What you don't lose is far more important than what you didn't gain. So you want to think about capital preservation within the context of diversification. Now, it's too late if you weren't diversified before you started. And the good news is for most people whose investments are in the stock market, weirdly, we've seen the stock market recover very quickly. And we should talk about that separately. But if you took a big hit in the stock market and you've seen it come back to the point that the S&P is now down 10% for the year. I mean, it was down in excess of 30% for the year. Diversify now, please. Make sure that you are invested across a cross section of things so that, we all got hurt. Didn't matter how well you were diversified. Everybody took a hit. But think about who you are and where you live and what your family is involved in, and make sure you're diversified in that broad a fashion. Make sure you're not overly exposed to it. Let's give you an example. If you're a healthcare worker who, maybe you're a doctor, and maybe your kids are doctors, maybe your wife's a doctor, maybe your husband's a doctor, your pharmacist or whatever, and you work in a place where healthcare is a big deal, then you want to make sure that your stock investments are not overly concentrated in healthcare as well. People take stock options from their companies because when certain industries get hit, all of it gets hit. Right now, we're seeing the energy industry get hit. We're seeing hospitality get hit. We're seeing restaurants get hit. So just try and think about that very carefully as a family. Try and think about the fact that we may be too overexposed geographically and by industry to a particular segment. So think about diversification in as broad a term as you can. If you are a business owner, cash preservation means stop spending on everything that is not basic operations and staffing. That's it. When talking to your staff, please be honest. Be as honest as you can. I think the best way to explain why it's better to be honest than to not be honest is we take a look at the confusion we've got coming from our political leaders, because people want to look good more than they want to be honest. Don't do that in business. Right now, a lot of, particularly our young people, will go with the adage, move fast and break things. And that's a terrific adage, generally speaking, for entrepreneurs. It is not for now. This is not the time to move fast, nor to break things. This is the time to make sure your capital is there. This is the time to reevaluate and triple check any expansion ideas you have. There will be, as there often is in a recession, opportunity in some places. What we have not seen yet is a collapse in housing prices, which is good. Interest rates are down, which is probably helping a little bit. And we haven't seen that yet. It's also not a financial crisis yet. So, and maybe it won't be. But there are often opportunities. There are opportunities to expand. You'll have opportunities to hire different people. But right now, capital preservation is really, really important. And I would say for people involved in technology, that may end up being the big story. Right? The role that technology has played in this shutdown is remarkable. I don't know how many people we've got in this session, but we're all talking on our internet, and the internet didn't break, and the internet's in everybody's house. I certainly probably did one Zoom webinar every 1.5 weeks or 2 weeks in the old world. Now everybody's got Zoom, or they're FaceTiming, or they're on Skype, or they're on Blue Jeans, or they're on whatever they've got. So that's amazing. We've got a robust internet. Technology is the only thing that will thrive in this particular time, and it will grow. So if you are in that field, that's worth it to think about. I would say for our young people, this is probably the most important thing. Give real thought to what you are studying or what you are planning to study for 2 reasons. One is, for some people, this is a forced vacation. I feel very badly for the kids in school who aren't able to go, or the kids who are in university who haven't been able to finish their year, especially if they're seniors in both cases. But this is an opportunity to think about your future, to think about whether you've made the right choices, to think about whether you want to make different choices. A lot of students in university will be invited to take a gap year or take a year off. This is a good place to think about what the future holds, and whether you're going in the right direction, or whether you're doing what you want to do, or what's going to be fruitful for your family. I'm just going to give you one example. A very lucrative job in this country right now is driving, truck driving in particular. In 29 states, it's the #1 job. That's a stat, by the way, that was popularized by Andrew Yang when he was running for office. Well, when we have autonomous vehicles, that's going to come crashing down. We haven't figured out how to drive trucks across the country yet autonomously, but you can load trucks and unload them with robotics. So every part of the logistics and transportation industry is automated except the driving. So that's something to think about. It's a growing and big and well-paid career that will suddenly end. in a few years. I don't know whether it's 5 years or 10 years, but it will come to an end. So think really carefully about what future you're invested in. It's never going to look the same. Movie theaters are not going to look the same. Shopping malls are not going to look the same. Living situations, working situations are not going to look the same. So take the moment not to ignore it like it's a storm or a holiday or something that's going on without you. You're in it. I mean, I know some people who are doing very basic things like improving their personal skills, their language skills. You know, people buy these programs and they learn languages. Self-improvement, self-evaluation, reevaluation, and diversification. And I don't just mean in stocks. Have a conversation with your family and say, is our risk spread out in a family in order to maintain it, in order to withstand something like this? Because we will have pandemics in the future. Hopefully we'll deal with them better than we're dealing with this one, but we'll continue to have them.
So everything that you say leads to a number of different pathways, right? It leads to a number of other questions. I'm almost like a kid in a candy store right now, looking to ask you about each one of the things that you touched upon. And Ali, I remember in one of our previous conversations, you talked about your wife, who's a venture capitalist. She wrote a letter to the technology companies in which she's invested. And you mentioned that it was a 10-page letter. 7 of those 10 pages were focused on capital preservation, right? I think the point that you made about capital preservation and cash preservation for all businesses is noted. It's incredibly important, and I think we should absolutely take that on board, and we will. Question is, how long should one provision for? Is this, well, you say not till September. Okay. In September, will things get better? Should we, once the funds that have been made available by the US government and other governments around the world, the PPP or EIDL or ERC, all these various subsidy programs that have been made available, once the funds run out, are we going to expect a 3rd round and a 4th round? And how, you know, what kind of help can we expect? Or are we left to our own devices? We need to create our own rainy day fund if we don't have one.
Right. Yes. The short answer to that question is yes. And that means if you can liquidate things, not long-term stock investments or property, but if you can liquidate things that that you can still get a market price for, it is worth thinking about that for capital preservation. Let me tell you why. We're in an emergency right now. So we've passed things on a bipartisan level in Congress that you would never hear about before. This airline plan is worth looking at. PPP is a good example, but the airline plan was unique. It was only Denmark has done something like this, where the money went directly to the airlines as long as they keep people on payroll until the end of September, right? So it's the idea is that you don't make people go onto unemployment, make them fill unemployment forms out, see if they qualify, do the paperwork, go through all the errors, then go for health care, depending on whether you get COBRA or you apply for Medicaid. You just keep people, you keep people paid for, and you pay the companies to keep them on payroll. It's a brilliant idea, but the further you get from an emergency, the more likely you are going to get political opposition to continued payment of money to people. Now, remember, we will probably see way more money continue to go to businesses from the largest businesses, and then it'll trickle down as you get to the smaller businesses. Because as you know, a lot of small businesses don't have an accountant on retainer, they don't have a lawyer, they don't have a business consultant, so they don't have relationships with the bank. You may have been at a bank for 15 or 20 years, but that doesn't count for anything since the last recession. So as you get lower and lower down the totem pole, people will get less money, including consumers. Humans will stop getting money at the earliest level. So it doesn't really matter what business you're in. If people don't have work, what do they do? Now, you will notice this week there have been several new projections out there about the infection toll and the death toll. Today, we have lost more than 79,000 people here in the United States. Major predictions from the University of Washington, from Johns Hopkins, from the Columbia Mailman School, and others have now predicted that with the loosening of restrictions, 43 states are now loosening restrictions, contact between people will increase. And as a result of that, they are now predicting somewhere between 120 to 130 thousand deaths by the end of August. So in other words, we're basically just at the peak. We may have as many deaths, even if we were at the peak today, which it's hard to demonstrate because unless you have several days where you have fewer infections and fewer deaths than the day before, you don't know the year. But assuming we're there, by definition, mathematically, you're going to have as many deaths on the way down as the way up. So if we're going to have this many deaths between now and the end of August, you can't imagine people's behavior is going to change all that much, right? They are still going to be cautious about how they interact with other people. Now, the airline program to subsidize the airlines ends at the end of September. PPP in most cases ends at the end of June. Then what happens? What happens if you're a business owner? The customers are not back. The government aid has stopped. People are not getting money, but they're not getting reemployed because some businesses are either not reopening or not reopening at full capacity. And the problem is now you're several months away. So now you've got pressure on the government. You have an election year. You've got all sorts of politics coming into play. And you don't want politics in your personal business. You don't want politics to affect your ability to put food on the table. So you have got to think of cash preservation now as if there isn't more money coming from the government. I hope there is. If I had to bet right now, I would tell you there is, but I don't know how much and for how long. Because in the end, this problem doesn't end unless there is a therapeutic or there is a vaccine. And neither of those look like they are on the horizon before the end of the year, despite the endless, I'd be most happy, Chairman, to be wrong, but neither of those are on the horizon at the moment. So until that happens, we're going to be using public money to finance our survival. I would just bet on the fact that that dries up sooner than you're going to expect. So think at any juncture, what can you liquidate? What can you use? But most importantly, what can you not spend on right now? Put off major expenditures. Now that's hard for the economy because if you were going to buy a car and you don't buy a car, someone gets affected by that. Some auto worker gets affected, some car dealership gets affected by it, your neighborhood gets affected by it, the car dealership doesn't advertise in your newspaper, so the newspaper gets affected by it. I get it. I get that we're not looking to try and stop the economy, but you have to make sure if the government doesn't decide to extend greater loans to your business or more money to your bank account, that you have a way to make it to next year.
Excellent point, Ali, and very, very clear, right? That A, we do not know how deep and how long this thing is, and how long is it going to last. B, the $3 trillion that the US government has pumped into the US economy, we don't know if there is a second wave or third wave. We don't know how long we'll have to prepare for this. So at this point in time, we should, what I hear you saying is that we should take advantage of the recovery in the market and look to see if there is a way for us to create liquidity and hold on to liquidity. Capital preservation and cash preservation is the name of the game. That's
look, I'm not a fan of telling people to sell their stocks at low prices. And remember, the one thing, imagine, look at the stock market and how it's been in the last 3 months. If you had gotten out, and many people did, at a point where you've lost a lot of money, how would you have known to get in at the point that resulted in the best month in the stock market that we've had in decades, right? People don't know that. That's the problem. You get out at the wrong time, you get in at the wrong time. So I really, really want to emphasize, I am not encouraging any level of day trading with anybody. I am saying, look at all the things in your life that might create cash for you and think about how you might access it. I mean, as I tell my viewers, at least know the password to get into your, your trading account if you have to. Just think these things through. Have a, every business has a worst case scenario, best case scenario, and the most likely middle scenario. Every family should have that. Every small business should have that. Every entrepreneur should have that. Every wage earner should have that. And if your worst case scenario is such that you cannot meet your payments, start having that conversation now with the people around you who can help you with that. You do not want to ever be looking to solve that problem at a moment where it's too late, right? No bank manager wants to talk to you at the point that you're insolvent. So let's start thinking about all of the options, as ugly and uncomfortable as they are now. I always think it's better to have some sleepless nights at the front end while you still got choices than the sleepless nights that you have no choices about. Excellent.
Very clear, Ali. Thank you so very much for that. So that's as far as all the business people are concerned, whether it's small, medium businesses, people that are in the capital investment phase or looking to deploy capital, entrepreneurs even. Let's move on to the professionals and the new age entrepreneurs, the technology, the AI, the various other industries that are really taking off lately over the last 10, 15 years. There's been tremendous growth in certain sectors of the economy. How do you see that continue? The innovation, will that continue? Will there be areas? Should we survive to fight another day, live to fight another day type of thing? How should people be positioned in the professions? You mentioned earlier about upgrading skills, learning a language, etc. What type of skills should we be acquiring in these times? How should we be positioning ourselves as professionals?
I think the future was coming at us, and now the future has slammed up into us, right? How many years, Chairman Saib, have we talked about people working from home and commuting? And you remember they tried it at Yahoo for a little while, then they shut it down and all that. Some companies do it, but most companies don't do it. And by the way, what we are learning in most companies is that lots of people can work from home. They never thought TV anchors can work from home, but guess what? I have been on TV for 2 months from my living room. And if I don't tell people, they might not know. Looks fantastic. Looks the same as it always looks. Telehealth, right? We talk to our doctors on our phones. That used to be the kind of thing you did in India when you didn't have a doctor for, 5 villages away, or you did in Alaska where you lived in a remote place and you didn't have doctors. Nobody did it in New York or major city. Why would you do this? Instead, we would call up our doctor. We would find an appointment that was a month away. We'd try and change it. We'd tell them we wanted to go. You'd sit in the room. The appointment wasn't when you thought it would be. It all changes now. Now everybody is going to do everything on their phones and on their computers. We didn't want to do medical stuff because of HIPAA laws, but guess what? We figured out how to do that. So all of this stuff changes. So if you are a professional, a few things to remember. Your income may take a hit. If you are a salaried professional, you may be asked by your company to take a pay cut. If you are a professional who gets a bonus at the end of the year, you should start planning at this point for the fact that there will be no bonus for 2020. In a lot of professions, the bonus is the bigger part of the remuneration. Wherever you are, if you're an executive or you're a senior person in a company and you're asking people to take pay cuts, you'll have to take a pay cut. So first of all, your income is probably going to diminish. But if you are in a professional realm, start thinking very actively about what form of remote work you can do, what technology you have to understand in order to do that, and what investments you might want to make. So while I talk about cash preservation, if you're a physician and your office doesn't do telehealth, you don't have to invent it because these are all platforms that you buy. That might be a good investment because that actually contributes to your cash preservation. In fact, if a doctor sees somebody on this kind of appointment, they're more efficient. Right? Because doctors are always running late anyway. This way you can have exactly the right amount of time. You can use commute time in, commute time home. Everything is going to be different. My pharmacy, which just for whatever reason didn't get into delivery, they just didn't like the idea, now delivers everything. And I don't get that much medication, but they text me every 3 days. You can get everything delivered. So keep these things in mind. That's the investment that you might make. That's the technology that you might invest in. Are you able to provide your customers with everything they need remotely? Meetings, the provision of service, the delivery of product, the ability to order. In retail, the concept of buy online, pick up in store has become very, very popular, even in places like Texas. Right, where people just don't think about these things. In Georgia and in Texas, you don't think about delivery services for basic things. Why would you? You can pull up your car anywhere you go, except now it's a health and safety issue. Think about that no matter what business you are in. What can you do from the smallest shop to the largest enterprise to convince your customers that they can access your product or your service in safety, and that you can keep your staff working in safety, and you can keep yourself in safety, and you can preserve as much of your income as possible because you're doing these things through technology. And then if you are actually in technology, that's even better, because that is the one industry that, and it is obviously a broad industry, whether it's telecom or AI or robotics or any form of technology, that's what's working. The one thing we tested, it was a great conversation I had with Bill Gates, who gets to, after all these years of being an internet pioneer, say, at least when we needed it, the internet didn't break. And touch wood, it hasn't broken. So embrace this. Knowing how to do Zoom and FaceTime and all that's not enough. It's enough to keep in touch with your parents. It's not enough to actually do business. So if you have not brought technology into your business, as little as you think your business could have used that technology, this is the moment to do it.
Excellent. So I know you mentioned data science, data analytics, AI, CAD CAM in our previous conversation. So all kinds of technologies can be deployed either in manufacturing or in services businesses. And I think one of the things that our IPN is doing a very good job of is sharing some of the technical skills, and a number of webinars have been taking place where the discussions have been around technical skills as well as softer skills. So on both ends of the spectrum, the IPN is covering several of them. So many of our Jamaati members, young professionals and others who want to benefit from it can certainly dial into that. Ali, a slightly more difficult segment, the hourly wage workers, right?
Yep.
I mean, maybe finding themselves out of a job. And with the Amazonification of this economy and more jobs being dependent on fulfillment, delivery, warehouse, etc., for people who find themselves out of employment in the hourly space, what are the options? What should they be doing? How can they prepare themselves, and how can they, use this time to improve their chances?
The Chairman, this is actually where I spend most of my time, right? I as much as I talk about the other things, this is the one that worries me the most for two reasons. One is this pandemic has shown us what the cracks are in our system. We knew what the cracks were, but if you were kind of ignoring it or you weren't really sure, you didn't want to admit it, now you get it. That there are people in this country who do not earn a wage that is sufficient to live on or support a family, who also, by the way, don't have health care, who also, by the way, are the ones who can't choose to be at home. So they are, it's a triple threat. Who knew that our frontline workers in this crisis were delivery people, workers who package things for companies, people who, they are our frontline workers. So the good news is we have now developed some degree of respect for the people who were unseen and not in our economy, including a lot of undocumented workers who are the ones out there working while the rest of us can stay at home. So the good news is there's political pressure, right? There is a movement out there for a universal basic income. I've been talking about universal basic income for several years. Andrew Yang joined me in the conversation. Chris Hughes from Facebook would talk about it. But the fact is nobody actually took that seriously because we had this view that why should you give people money for nothing? And now we're starting to realize that the Pope talked about it the other day, of all people. So we're now beginning to realize that maybe for things like this, what you don't want is people who can't afford to not go to the doctor if they think they've got coronavirus symptoms and go to work and be carriers of a virus. Number two, we've got what's something called the fight for 15 in this country, the fight for a $15 minimum wage. That has gained steam in this conversation because what we've realized is that, and this probably applies to people who live in the South, the minimum wages are very low. They can be as low as $7.25. That's the federal minimum wage. Can't live in anywhere for that kind of money. But these are not people in the weird periphery. These are people, if you get off a plane at an airport, you might be encounter a cleaner who earns that kind of money. $7.25 is $15,000 a year. $15,000 is $30,000 a year. This is not crazy to expect in the richest country in the world that people can earn this income. This morning I spoke to a former head of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. When you go into your office and they've got a sign there that tells you what you're entitled to in terms of safety and things like that, if they were to inspect every business in the United States, each business would get inspected once every 165 years. So we don't have enforcement for safety for people. All we can do at the moment, and what I do, is I bring this to everybody's attention every time I am on TV, and we hold politicians to account to say, this must be the lesson we learn from this. So that if we have a pandemic, we can all deal with the fact that there's a virus and whatever, but everybody should be able to get health care, and everybody should be able to earn a wage, and everybody should be able to protect themselves, right? That wasn't something we've thought about until we've heard about these fires where people get stuck in their factories and things. Now we realize there is risk for wage earners in just doing their jobs. They don't have the privilege that I have of doing 100% of what I do from inside. So when I started by saying we have to look after community, think about that in your community. I literally think about everybody in my community who is a wage earner, whose wages have stopped because they are service providers in an informal economy, which exists. and how we can help them. People should continue to pay their service providers, even if some of that service is not coming. But think about everybody around you, because what we do not have is an infrastructure, a governmental infrastructure, to take care of those who are least among us. If you know a wage earner who is feeling ill, we have to make sure they get tested. We have to make sure they understand that if they have to take a few days off, 2 weeks off to get sick, that's a cost society is going to have to bear. So unfortunately, if you are that person, I'd love to tell you to sit and learn another language and get Rosetta Stone and learn coding and all that kind of stuff. But most wage earners can't. Most wage earners are busy earning wages, probably in 2 to 3 jobs at a time. So to the extent that you can improve your skills, do. To the extent that there are people in your family, if you are a wage earner, who can improve their skills, make sure that happens. But to those of you who can't afford to do that, my heart goes out to you, because this is a difficult time. When I look out, you know, somebody told me the other day on TV, you look tired. They tweeted me. And I said, I'm tired. They said, you should rest. And I said, I'll rest when they rest, because I look outside my window and I see doctors and I see police and I see EMTs and I see all these great people who are saving our lives, but I see delivery men. I see doormen. I see, you know, I see people working in the stores who can't not work at the stores. I see parents, mothers and fathers who run little bodegas and convenience stores who don't have other choices. And to me, they're as much the heroes as everyone else. So I only promise you this, that history will bear witness to the fact that they are also our frontline workers, and may they never face a crisis like this in the way that they've faced it this time.
Thank you, Ali. Let's go back to one of the themes you touched upon earlier, being diversification, right? You talked about if families and individuals are concentrated in one business, one profession, one occupation, or one sector, energy, for instance, gas station, convenience stores, you own 3-4 gas stations at the same time, you're invested in Shell, and you know all the other stocks are also. Right. So talk a little bit about diversification, but also, if you can, talk about, are there any safe harbors out there other than cash? You mentioned cash and to sit it out while the storm is going about, but where else are there safe harbors that the Jamaat sit it out?
So I would say, given the turmoil in the world, real estate continues to be a safe harbor. Now, not all real estate, right? If you're in New York City and if you have a 1-bedroom apartment, there's never been a point at which the value of a 1-bedroom apartment has gone down, because everybody in the world wants to move to New York. If you have a 9-bedroom apartment on Park Avenue, things might get a little tough for you in recessions. But small, practical, utilitarian property in major centers continues to do well, and with lower interest rates, that'll continue to benefit. Again, technology does do well. Technology you have to be careful of, because it can have big run-ups and then come down, but the NASDAQ is actually positive. So technology is an important place to be. You can't always choose where you live, right? We have people probably listening to this who are in Calgary or Edmonton or Houston, and that's great, because a lot of the time it's really prosperous. But if you do live in a place that's dependent on a particular industry, and you do have a business that's dependent on a particular industry, think cautiously about every other part of your investment. So again, I tell viewers, for instance, don't try and pick stocks, invest in the S&P 500. But if you happen to be so heavily exposed to energy because you live in a place that's all about energy, and your home price will be connected to it, and your job might be connected to it, then maybe you want to look at something, a basket of investments that is as broad as the S&P 500, meaning lots and lots of stocks, X energy. Right? Take out the thing that you're otherwise overly exposed to, so that if this part of your life takes a hit, this part of your life doesn't take a hit. That's a complicated one, because most finance books won't tell you that, personal finance books, and most people just tell you, just invest in the S&P 500. But I use the healthcare example. I would say the same thing for technology. Let's say you're involved in a technology company and you live in Palo Alto. Be careful, because your stock portfolio will be full of technology. So don't add stock investments if you happen to live in Palo Alto and work for a technology company and maybe even get paid in stock from a company. Enron is obviously always the all-time best example, right? Because people there didn't invest broadly in the market. Many of them invested in Enron stock. So when the company went bankrupt, they lost their job, they lost their income, and they lost their investments. That's the kind of thing you want to be careful of right now. And as the market has come back, that may be your opportunity to get out of things that you're otherwise too involved in. So again, I make the point about real estate. Let's say you like to dabble in real estate. You want to buy a few rental properties. That's great. Make sure you're not overly exposed to real estate in your stock investments. This is not high science. You can figure this out on a lot of websites on how to do that, because there are baskets of stocks, index funds, ETFs, exchange traded funds that you can buy where you can concentrate in a particular area, or you can use a filter to say, find me an ETF that doesn't invest in energy stocks or doesn't invest in other things. I would say that's, use every form of diversification you can find. Sit around with your family and say, what are we overexposed to? And it may be that you got 5 members of your house, your immediate family, and they're all invested in property in the same general area. So if property were to go down, you're invested there. So where else do you look? The answer is different for every individual and every business, but it's boring to talk about diversification. It's the first thing every financial manager talks to you about. It's the first thing every book tells you about, but there's a reason for it. Diversification is really important. The other thing I want to think about right now, and I think people should think about, and I think people have been thinking about, is wills, estate planning, and how this wealth gets passed from generation to generation, which is not just about whether your books are in order and your accounts are in order and your estate planning is in order. Who runs your business if you get coronavirus? Who runs your business if you get coronavirus and it doesn't work out well for you? We don't like to think about these things. We never like to think about these things. Average age continues to go up that we live to. We've got great advances in medical science, except 80,000 people have died from this one thing we didn't even know the name of 3 months ago. So you can't wait till the last minute to think about these things. Every family should think about this kind of thing. Generational wealth transfer is important, but if you run a business and you're the only one who knows the combination to everything, and you haven't had that conversation with your family, and you don't have any sense about what succession looks like, but you've been here for 30 years and you ran a business on your own, you wouldn't want to see that disappear. So these are all things that we can control. The uncontrollable is what the virus does and what the government does. The thing you can control are these things.
Excellent advice, Ali. And this reminds me of Winston Churchill's quote, never let a good crisis go waste, right? Said it in the context of the Second World War, but I think it's incumbent on us to try and make the most of this crisis, right? I mean, yes, there will be opportunities, which we'll talk about shortly, but how can we deploy this time and this period that we find at the bottom of this curve? Hopefully we're at the bottom of the curve. How do we deploy it to our best advantage? How do we position ourselves the best? Okay, so we talked about the situation so far. How should different segments be positioned? How do we know that a recovery is underway? How do we know that there are green shoots? What are the metrics? What are the indicators that we should be looking out for green shoots to know that, yeah, it's time to step out into the water again?
Yeah, hard to know. The market used to be a good barometer of it. The stock market, it's not anymore. In fact, if you looked at the stock market's performance over the last month, you'd not only think there were green shoots, you'd think we're well out of this thing. So I caution people about that. The market is its own beast. Take advantage of the fact that it's up. Diversify, redeploy your money, your stock investments, but it's not an indication of things. But even with the stock market, I look back at the 2008-2009 recession, and the bottom of the market was March 9th, 2009. And the reason I remember that date is because I wouldn't have had any idea on March 9th, 2009 that was the bottom of the market. Bottoms are rocky, and you don't know what they look like. Now, in America in 2020, the best indication of improvement is wages, and wages are directly tied to jobs, right? So what we saw after the last recession is it took us 5 or 6 years to recover the jobs lost, but it was much longer that was about 5 or 6 years before we got wages to the point that they were growing, because there were so many people unemployed that you had nobody who needed a job had the ability to negotiate wage for 5 or 6 years. Then in 2015, we started to see small wage increases. And it was about 2017 or so where the wage increases got to the point that the pool of available workers was so tight that real wage increases came along, which, by the way, was just a course of history thing, right? Because we bottomed out in 2009, and it took us from 2009 to 2016-ish to get rid of all the extra capacity. Turns out the president likes to quote that and say that he created good wages in this country, but it's mathematical if you look at it. It just happens to be the way the curve was going. But that's the issue, that it took us that long to get to that point. We are not going to see wage growth in this country for a long, long time. I mean, we went into this thing, you said unemployment's 14.7%. It was 4.4% in March. It was 3.5% in February, 3.5%. I mean, I went through my career hearing that if you ever went below 5%, that was considered full employment, because 5% of the people were always looking to do something other than work, right? Go back to school, retire, they made enough money. And we were at 3.5% unemployment. That's broken now. And we're not going to get back to that. We're not going to get back to that soon. And people who were deploying the technological things that were going to get them to artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, are going to deploy that even faster than they were. I want to remind everybody who has an iPhone, these things are made in China. In China, they're made by Foxconn. Foxconn is replacing its workers. The reason we make these in China is because China is the best workforce you can get at the lowest labor rate. Now Foxconn is replacing its workers with robots. Can you imagine that? So the place that we outsource to, because it's so much cheaper to make an iPhone there, is now going to use robots. The whole world's going to use robots more than we are. So I worry that the automation that we were already seeing as a threat, and by the way, many Americans will have realized this was a threat since the 1980s, is going to be advanced. So unless you are able to participate at a higher level, some call it the knowledge economy, but if you have to participate at a higher value level, the things you do have to be at a higher level, that's going to be a problem. So I would argue that this is something high school kids should think about, university students should think about. But I think you should think about it if you're 25 or 35 or 45 or maybe even 55, right? What can I do to improve my value add? Because the world is going to be a different place. And there are many people in this country who are, say, manufacturing workers who saw layoffs starting in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s. And for some reason, they didn't lose their job. They weren't laid off. In the end, entire industries will stop, right? The coal industry, gone. But we've lied to them for 20 or 25 years to say, politicians run and they say, we'll bring your jobs back. We're not going to bring the jobs back. We're never bringing coal back. It's never coming back. So if you are in that position, even if you're not 20 and you can't redo your degree, maybe you can, by the way, but you really have to, like I said, really think about your planning, really think about your estate planning, really think about your diversification, really think about your skills. The beauty of this in 2020, this screen, is that I can take university level courses here. I can do all sorts of things. I can learn actual real skills. There's a shortage of pilots. There's a shortage of mechanical engineers in this country. There are real things you can do 80, 90, 100% of the training at home. You can get loans for that. You can use time that you're not working. So whenever people are out of a job, they always stress about the fact that they're out of a job. And I always say, you're going to get a job eventually. You might as well enjoy it or do something fun. This is that moment. Use this time to improve your skills, because the new world will not look like the one that we left behind in February.
Fantastic, Ali. Speak about the new world, right? You just mentioned the new world. Let me read to you an assessment of a recent round of chief investment officers. When they got together, their assessment was that the post-crisis world is expected to be more indebted, more digital, with higher taxation and moderately higher inflation, and potentially less global, with a growing sense of populism and protectionism. How can businesses and professionals be positioned to successfully navigate through this new landscape? First of all, do you agree with this assessment? And
yeah, I don't like it, but I agree with it. I think it's true. And I think the first and the last are the most important. The indebted thing. We are a wildly indebted society. We are a wildly indebted world. Corporate debt, government debt, household debt, right? Most people don't think about that, right? They don't think about corporate debt. They don't think about government debt. They don't know how it affects them. You do understand household debt. We have too much of it on every level. So that's problematic. Part of the attraction is we've got zero interest rates. So debt costs us nothing, right? Some of us remember days when there were interest rates were 15 and 20%. Then you know a lot about debt. If you buy a house, try and get a mortgage at 20%, you're very, very conscious of how much more your house costs you. But you can get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage for 3% now, 3.5%. So you don't think about it. Why not take on all the debt that you can? Now, for countries, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you spend that money for the right reasons. We have a remarkably bad history in this country of spending the money for the wrong reasons, right? We don't have as good infrastructure as other countries do. China does better than we do. Our airports suffer, our rail suffers, our water, our electrical system, our gas lines. But we don't do that. Now, if we were to do that, there are some people arguing we should have a Roosevelt-style works projects administration, big project that we hire people who are unemployed and we really fix the country. With indebtedness is really a problem. It's also a problem in our dealings with China, for instance. We are so heavily indebted to China that Donald Trump wants to take a hard line on trade with China, and there are a lot of people who think he's right to do so. You can only take so hard a line with China because China owns most of our new debt. So indebtedness is a major problem. The other side of that is the populism. This has been growing. The Arab Spring was populism. The refugees going to Europe created populism in Western Europe. We then saw Brexit, which was a harbinger of what we were going to see in the United States. And we saw it in the United States. Now, I will say this to anybody who's watching this from Canada or other places. Countries with strong social safety nets experience less of the populism. It's not gone, it's not there, but it's a little less attractive than it is because populism works in a place where you can convince people that anything you don't have is because somebody else has it. So if you didn't get into university, it's because they're letting this group of people in. If you didn't get this job, it's because of affirmative action, or it's because, whatever. There's all sorts of nonsense excuses. And that grows in inequality. And what we are seeing is the growth of populism has completely come along with the growth of inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality in the world. This pandemic's going to make that worse. We're only going to come out of this thing more unequal, right? Every recession makes inequality worse because if you go into a recession with money and the ability to take on more debt, you buy properties, you buy factories that have been vacated, you buy businesses that are being sold at a fire sale, and you're better off in the other end. If you go into it poor or without the ability to access credit, you come out of it worse. So that's when you get populist, right? That's when you vote for people who promise you that they can do things. And this is on the left and the right, who promise you that they can do things that might be unreasonable. So that's the one place that we do have a little bit of control. Can't control national debt and corporate debt, but you can control populism, and that is through political engagement, right? Populism stagnates when there is good policy, when there is good politics, when people are really involved, when smart people run for office. So I want to encourage people. One thing that the last few years of populism has done in the world is it has caused a lot of people who never gave politics a second thought a reason to run for office. And that is an interesting way that individuals can fight populism.
Excellent. Ali, let me read this quote to you from John F. Kennedy. The Chinese use two brushstrokes to write the word crisis. One brushstroke stands for danger, the other for opportunity. In a crisis, be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity. In one of our previous conversations, you mentioned some of the best companies have been formed in downturns. So clearly, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we look back, there will be value having been created in this time, right? Where should we be looking? Where are the opportunities? And keeping in mind that today we have a global audience, we have folks calling in from a number of different countries. And so help us with sectoral opportunity, country-wise opportunity, and thematic opportunity. Are there sectors, technology, et cetera? So your
Okay, so the one thing I want to caution people about is don't be hyper specific about this, because we know that Zoom does very well. We know that Peloton have done very well, and they may both be good investments, or Roku, or these streaming players and stuff like that. But don't be a momentum player. Look carefully before you invest in anything that's not a fund or an ETF. Look very carefully at why you're investing that. Look at the earnings. Look at what analysts say about that. It could be that Peloton, this has been a great company since it started. It's kind of amazing, right? They say you exercise at home. People are going to exercise at home more. That's going to be one of the outcomes. Now, maybe once we've got a vaccine, we won't. We'll get back to a normal in which we don't care. We hug each other. We shake hands. We do that. But maybe we won't. So companies like Peloton will do well. But if they get into your house and that becomes your way of exercising, you'll probably stay with it and buy their products. If you went on to Roku or Fire Stick or Apple TV or Google Chromecast, or TiVo's got a new device and you replaced your cable with all that stuff, you'll probably stick with it over time. So there may be recurring investments on that front in terms of opportunity. I think generally speaking, there is opportunity here, but if I look back to the last recession and I look at the big companies that came out of it, and there are many, including Uber and Airbnb and places like that, none of them were actually a response to the recession. In other words, smart people were just creating. So maybe with the Chinese brushstrokes, there should be a middle one, right? There's crisis, there's danger, there's opportunity, and then in the middle, there's just people who are doing their work. Right? Somebody had an idea for Airbnb because hotel rooms were too expensive. Somebody had an idea for Uber, which, by the way, until it succeeded, was the stupidest idea going, because they were up against every taxi lobby in every city. I mean, that was just a company that was formed on the basis that they were going to have endless legal fights, endless litigation. But it ended up working. And so the point is, there is an element of being shut in at home. There's an element of people running for the hills that says, if you've got an interesting idea, this might be a time to nurture that idea or to put some water on that idea. And I will remind people that for all the danger in the world right now, we were in a world in which there was an excess of capital. There was money splashing around all over the place looking for a place to park. And that still exists. Right? The richest of the rich people, the people with money, the venture capitalists, those people, private equity people, they still have money to invest, and they still want to understand. They want to, anybody who looks like they've got a vaccine or a product that is going to help people live a comfortable life in the post-pandemic era will find investments. I remind people about 9/11. When it happened, it felt existential. Right? People who were in New York when 9/11 happened, there was a sense around you that the world as you knew it was ending. The stock market had recovered all of its 9/11 losses within 30 days of 9/11. Okay, so sometimes the stock market does know things that we don't know. I think it was still a different market back then in that it was still based on some fundamentals, and today's stock market is mostly based on momentum and algorithms. But the market came back very quickly. And but for some changes, some of which are very uncomfortable because they're privacy invasions and there's cameras everywhere you go in certain cities, but basically, but for the fact that you've got to take your sneakers off when you go through airport security, we have learned to manage our lives in a post 9/11 era, and it hasn't been all that existential. It has been for certain people in certain parts of the world where terrorism still looms large, but generally speaking, for us, it didn't change all that much. We will still remember, you can sort of remember telling your kids about things that were a different way back then. Well, that's what this is going to be. People are going to come up with products and ways that you can, I don't know, sit on planes or go to movie theaters or go to a restaurant and close yourself in some kind of a portable bubble that you cleaned yourself. I don't know what the ideas are because I'm never smart enough to, I only report on them. But there are going to be opportunities that are born out of the crisis. And there are going to be opportunities that have nothing to do with the crisis, but there are people who are just building businesses, because every given year in America, around the world, people are building businesses. So don't close yourself off to both of those types of things, that there will be new neat things and there will be new things that are being developed, and there are things that are just being improved upon, usually with respect to technology. Globally, I think the thing that is dominating this age is, as you said, protectionism, high levels of debt, isolationism, issues with trade, technology, outsourcing. Those themes have been with us for 10 or 15 years, and they're not going away. So in the end, this still remains a consuming world, right? We may not go outside all the time, so everybody's just ordering stuff. It's being delivered to their house, or they're buying online and picking it up at the curb. We all still buy stuff. And all that stuff that is bought is still made in lower wage countries. There's been a lot of pressure to say, for security reasons, let's build more things in each of our countries. But that's not really true. It's a false premise. The reason we don't have enough masks in America is not that we don't have the capacity to build masks. We just weren't doing it. So we may think that one through a little bit more, because why would you build a mask using $25 an hour labor when you can build it using, $1 an hour labor somewhere else in the world? So those themes aren't going to change. Bangladesh and the Philippines and Vietnam and China are not suddenly going to become crazy expensive. China will become a little more expensive. So I don't know that geographically, I think we're in a broken period anyway, and we were broken before the pandemic, and this is just going to make us reassess those trade relationships a little bit more. But I don't know that I see anything that looks like a unique green shoot as a result of this pandemic. Back in 2008, 2009, it was about the financial industry. It was caused by the United States and our financial tools. This wasn't, so it's not clear to me who succeeds out of this and who doesn't. I will say one thing: we will know probably in 2 years or 3 years whose experiments with how to deal with coronavirus worked better. The Swedes decided they're going to try and create herd immunity, and they're not going to have much of a lockdown. At the moment, it doesn't look all that successful. The South Koreans got coronavirus the same day Americans did, and they're back to having soccer games and going out to restaurants and stuff. So we'll see what happens. 43 states here are opening up. We don't know how this is going to go, but assuming that we get a handle on this disease in the next few months, you'll see opportunities growing. It just won't be clear. It's not clear to me yet where we're looking for green shoots.
So, Ali, before the pandemic, right? I mean, China was the workshop of the world. There was a lot of work being manufactured, and we were relying on just-in-time delivery, supply chains being what they were. Apple was manufacturing in Foxconn in Taiwan and China, etc. And we got it just in time to sell it in the stores pre-Christmas, if you will, the new 11 or 12 or whatever the number might be. You think the companies will reevaluate their supply chain? I mean, they'll try to bring it closer to home. So, for instance, the US companies, will they continue to want to be dependent on the Chinese supply chain? Will they try to create, even if it's a little bit redundant, a little bit inefficient, will they look to do that? And are there opportunities in the supply chain for us to look into?
So I think they will, and I'll tell you why. Just-in-time supply chains have saved a lot of companies. Right? If we don't know how we don't know what visibility is like into the next month. So we're, in the third quarter, we don't know what visibility is like. Retailers have no idea what visibility is like in the fourth quarter. Come Christmas and Thanksgiving and holiday shopping, are malls going to be back open? Are people going to go into malls? Will you stand in front of a Macy's because they tell you there are too many people in line and wait, or will you buy it online? So the ability to stop forward ordering is better today than it's ever been. Right? In the non-just-in-time world, your forward ordering had to be done very long in advance. There's still long lead times for things like retail if you're shipping things from China to America, but they're shortened. So in fact, if you're worried about insecurity and pandemics and things that could affect the cycle, having just-in-time ordering is a better thing. But yeah, supply chains are a problem. We're hearing about it in the United States with restaurants, for instance. They're having issues because some factories are closing, but those are domestic factories. So I don't know that fundamentally our way of doing business from a supply chain perspective is going to change. I think it's still going to keep on going in that you buy as little as you need in as timely a fashion as you need. What I think will change is that certain things we will want closer to home. Right? I just think we're going to have to figure out a way that says we're going to need this many N95 masks. We're going to need this many gloves. We're going to need this much stuff. So cell phones are the best example. They use rare earth minerals. Every cell phone, all electronics use rare earth minerals. China's got a complete lock on rare earth minerals. That's it. There's nobody else who does it. I think there's one mine in the US that deals with rare earth minerals. That's a problem, because you can't improvise your way around it. But we can improvise our way around rubber gloves and N95 masks and ventilators and things like that. So I think you're going to see, from an emergency preparedness, a rush to have certain things made locally, but I think a few companies can handle that. I mean, we have major assembly lines. I'm not worried about that. I don't know that I see a fundamental shift in the way we buy and order stuff. Ultimately, if you look at a place like Norway, which has a higher standard of living, higher incomes and higher prices, and they've got more tariffs on a few things, life's pretty good, but nobody's got as robust an economy as the United States has, generally speaking. We are kind of, I don't think you can, that horse has left the barn. I don't know that you can change that back. So I think we're going to make some things. I'll give you a perfect example. Boeing, in a normal world, would have gone out of business on the basis of the 737 stuff, and then the fact that there are no planes flying. A company like that would have gone out of business. But most people forget Boeing is not a passenger airplane company, it's a defense contractor. So Boeing will never go out of business. It's America's biggest export. So, you know, I don't think we can declare everything an emergency or a national security industry, and I don't think we will. So I think fundamentally supply chains are going to look the same as they do. I think we're going to have a really good examination of organizations like the World Health Organization to say, can we make sure that we all have we're working off the same page when we find out about a virus or an illness? You know, we're learning that we could have known about this earlier. We could have reacted to it earlier. There may have been earlier cases in China. There may have been earlier cases in the United States. That kind of stuff, there's going to be development in. But I fundamentally think this is a health crisis. Once you solve for that, you're not going to solve for the rest of it.
I see. In terms of people of like businesses and like professions coming together to leverage the opportunities that lie ahead, how do you see that, and how would you suggest we approach?
That's brilliant. Like that's where the strength lies, right? That's exactly what has to happen. If that's ever mattered, you know, in some of these organizations and affiliations have been formed, you know, for sharing interest, but largely for purchasing power. It's now more important than that. It could be for mutual benefit, right? It could be that somebody's having a particular problem because they're in an area that's shut down, but others can help. Hotels, for instance, everything about a hotel is going to change, right? We are now going to want to make sure who touched everything, how clean was it. Doctors, this whole business about making sure that you can do telemedicine. It may not be economically viable for a one-off doctor's shop, but boy, if you're part of a consortium, in some way you can share the cost of the technology install. So I think for the capital expenditures, remember, like I said with my wife's project, 7 out of 10 pages was capital preservation. For those expenditures you have to make, if you can be involved in other people who can help make those expenditures along with you, or split the capital cost, that may be one of the greatest benefits. There are certain industries where you are going to live or die on the basis of whether you can convince your customers they're safe and convince the world that you keep your staff safe, because you don't want the liability of not keeping your staff safe as well. So there are businesses that are just going to have to change some things about what they do. Right? The hotel industry is going to struggle. Anything to do with tourism is going to struggle. Cruises are going to have to struggle. And they're going to have to be able to sell you. I got an email from Marriott yesterday, I think, explaining the new techniques they're using to keep the hotels clean and germ-free and how that relates to you. Because that's going to be my one concern, right? The minute I get onto if I have to take a business trip, the vehicle in which I get to the airport is going to be an issue. The airport itself is going to be an issue, and all the way I board the plane is going to be an issue, the car is going to be an issue, and the hotel is going to be an issue. Businesses will thrive if they can convince you that they are safe and their people are safe. So it's hard to do as a one-off business, but if you're a restaurant and you can talk to other restaurants in your neighborhood or other people in your consortium and say, hey, what can we all do to make the purchases necessary and install the best practices and communicate it in the best way, because maybe you'll want to join your consortium just for the purposes of advertising that these restaurants subscribe to this minimal level of cleanliness or whatever the case is. So business associations now matter more than they did before.
Thank you, Ali. A slightly different take, and we want to try and bring this to a closure over the next few minutes. We promised our participants that we'll have a little discussion around personal finance as well. I know we're not looking to you for specific stock advice or what stocks to buy and whatnot. And clearly you mentioned that day trading is not what you do or what you recommend. So totally understand that. But given that many of our listeners are, they have retirement savings, 401k plans, IRAs in the US, and similarly in other countries, they might have retirement savings. You know, what sort of stance would you recommend for that longer term, right? And how should people approach the investment in terms of time horizon, their savings, and the 401k retirement plan segment?
Generally speaking, if you're under 55 and in good health, you shouldn't think about it any differently, right? You can go onto any personal finance website and find a risk tolerance questionnaire. Everybody's got them. They work the same in every country. You answer a bunch of questions, often unrelated to your finances, but it tells you how much risk you're prepared to take. And some of these questionnaires trick you, right? They'll ask you about, do you like roller coasters or do you like mini golf? Just to get a sense of what you're like as a person. Nobody should ever invest outside of their comfort zone, right? You might be inherently a risk taker. You might be 23 years old with two professional or wealthy parents. No worries, your education's paid for and you've got 50 working years ahead of you. You can take any risk you want, right? Everybody can't do that, and everybody shouldn't do that. So again, I remind people, the money you don't lose is much, much, much more important than the money you don't make. You take a risk tolerance questionnaire and it generates a pie chart, or it generates a thing that says you should be, this percentage of your investment should be in blue chip stocks. This percentage should be in lower risk stocks. It gives you a whole, there's 8 different categories, 8 or 9 different categories, and try and be honest about that. Then make your investments reflect that, and then make sure that as often as you, 4 times a year, rebalance it. So, because we get very excited, we're invested in a particular sector and it surges forward, and that was supposed to be 30% of my investments and now it's 45% of my investments. Really, you should sell the extra part of it and make sure you get back to 30% and buy the stuff that's underrepresented. It's just not hard science, but people don't want to sell things that are doing well and they don't want to buy things that are doing poorly. But that is the only way you can diversify. I've been studying this for a long time. I think people have been studying diversification for about 5,000 years. There's just no other way to diversify except to actually be diversified. So number 1, do that. Number 2, take a look at the S&P 500. It was down well in excess of 30%, right? I mean, we've never seen anything like this. We have, but it's rare. But look at a chart. I always put a chart on my up for my viewers of the S&P 500 or the Dow over 100 years. You only notice a couple of things. You notice the recession of 2008, 2009. You notice the Great Depression. That's it. You don't notice anything else. It just looks like a chart that goes up. Stock markets generally perform over time. So if most of your retirement investment is in stocks, don't make panic moves. You get out at the wrong time and you won't know when to get back in, because in the last 3 months, if you had gotten out and you're still out, you missed all the gain. So now you've sold at a loss, and then you're going to buy in a different way. So let's say you did sell out, because maybe you're watching this and you did do that. Don't buy the market on its hard charging days. We're going to see days where it goes down 3 or 4%. Start to put money in, average it in, go in on a slow basis, right? You can read about all of these things. You can read about it in my books. You can read about it in Susie Orman's books, anybody's books. You don't have to read about it anywhere. Go to Investopedia on the internet and look at it. But be very cautious about that, because just in the same way that people don't make good decisions about getting out, they don't make good decisions about getting into the market either. So you should stay invested. Now, if you see something bad coming and you're a little bit panicked, you can certainly bring down your investments. But do everything in an organized fashion, and do everything every 3 months regardless. So now that we're in this panic, set a time and do whatever you have to do with your investment accounts, and then make sure you check it again in 3 months. Don't just listen to the news. Look at what's going on. I think there's 2 things that have come out of this whole pandemic that people should get smarter about while they've got some time at home to read up. Read up a little bit about how markets work, and read up a little bit about the difference between a virus and a bacteria. I worry about people who, decided not to go to take science in school, and we don't realize the difference between virus and bacteria. There's some basic things that you should know in life. You should know a little bit about biology, and you should know a little bit about how markets work. I would say this: I am yet to see the market downturn that has not recovered. And when I say this on TV, I get all sorts of tweets from people who say, you people are the corporate media and you just want people to keep the stock market invested. Doesn't make any difference to me. I got no dog in this hunt. I invest the same way everybody else does, using ETFs and index funds. I'm actually forbidden from making specific direct investments because of my job. So I don't have any interest in whether people buy or don't buy stocks. The evidence is that the stock market is remarkably resilient. And part of that is in this particular world, while there's a lot of debt, there's also a lot of cash. And while interest rates are as low as they are, there's no other game in town other than real estate. So I would say this, when you see interest rates start rising and you see things start happening, reconsider your allocation. But you can, by the end of today, it'll take you 1 hour to do a risk questionnaire, a test, and you can print it out. You can print it out in a color pie chart if you want, and it'll tell you what your stock should look like. Compare that to your stock investments. If they don't look the same, that's your homework for today.
Excellent. Ali, you've done such a fantastic job that you get a bonus question today. And the bonus question is just before the last question, where we invite you to give your closing comments on your thoughts, on parting thoughts to all the various segments who have dialed in. Bonus question is there any question you would ask yourself that we haven't asked you so far on the topic that we're covering today?
Look, I really, one of the things I remember very, very clearly, you know, whenever there's big events in life, you remember where you were at that moment or what it was like going through it. So the big event in my life, the one that, you know, took most of my time and I spent my most on was the last recession. And, you know, I was in it, I started at 5 in the morning and I'd work till midnight every night because we were on TV at CNN at the time for that long. And I remember seeing the cracks in society back then. I remember realizing that these things don't hit everybody the same way. And now I realize how much more serious that is than it was. So I will say this, most people will make it through just fine. We'll regain our prosperity. If you're young enough, you will probably see most of it back in a few years, and we will have a new economy. But things are fundamentally broken in the way we treat each other, in the way society treats each other. And I want people to think about this as much as a moral journey as it is a journey about prosperity. Let's remember those who are around us. We have newfound respect, I think, in many cases for the people who are out there, because it's really easy to see, right? I live in an apartment building in Manhattan most of the time, and I look outside and I can see who's outside. And I can see who's out there because they're jogging, but who's out there because they have to work. Let's let that inform our decisions about how we move forward, because I am confident that everybody tuned in here will make good decisions and the world will smile on them, and in most cases they'll be okay. But there are people around us who won't be, and that's what I want to come out of this, because when we look at changing the things that are broken in society, the excuses are always that it's really hard and it's really going to cost a lot of money. Well, guess what? Everything we're doing right now is really hard and it's going to cost a lot of money. So if you've lost a third of your house and you rebuild it, you want to rebuild it as well as you can. That is our opportunity now, to rebuild our house as well as we can, so that everybody who lives in it can feel safe and can prosper. And so next time something like this happens, we're stronger, not weaker.
Excellent. Any parting thoughts, Ali, for any of the segments of the Jamaat that's dialed in?
Only that I really do think this is a great opportunity for some people to think about their ideas, think about big ideas you've got, think about changes you wanted to make to your life, think about things in which you wanted to, ways in which you wanted to improve, the languages you wanted to learn. I am really, I think if you think about this as an opportunity, if you can get yourself out of the panic stage and sort of say, hey, I got a little free time that I might not have again. Remember to talk to your employers about whether you like this way of working. There are people who are open to all sorts of changes. Your life could look very different in a year, and it might not be bad. So I think it's back to what John F. Kennedy said about the Chinese, right? It's a crisis. There's danger. There's no question. The danger is very real. But for each of us, there may be opportunity. I had a great conversation 2 nights ago with a professor named Angela Duckworth. She's done a great TED Talk that if anybody hasn't listened to, you should. She's fantastic. She wrote a book called Grit. And grit is that thing that's inside you all the time. And when I said, how do we capitalize on that grit in this time of panic and fear and anxiety? And she said, do the things you can control. Identify all the things in your life that you can control and start doing them now. And boy, you will feel a lot better every day, that you're not sitting here at the mercy of your governors and your president and virologists and people like that. Do the things you can control. You can keep yourself together, you can run your household, you can keep yourself fed, and you can improve yourself. And then the rest of the world will take care of itself.
On that note, Ali, we'd like to thank you for your time, for your guidance, your advice. It's been wonderful talking to you today, and inshallah, we'll have you back again.
My pleasure.
So that we can take stock of the recovery as it takes place. Thank you once again.
Do it regularly.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thank you to all the people who've dialed in today, or all the members who've logged in from different time zones. We thank you for this. An email will be sent with the recording, a link to the recording, to everyone who's registered for this webinar. And in closing, we'd like you to kindly stay home, save lives, continue to take the precautions, even as various states and various regions start loosening up the lockdown period or the lockdown conditions. So as per the National Council's suggestions, these are some of the steps that we can take to save lives. We hope you stay safe. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers in our lives, and let's stay safe. Ya Ali Madat.